I'm here today with Ed Sparrius, and he is part of an organization in Australia called Stop Safe Schools. And when I first saw the name of that, am I saying it wrong? Okay, why don't you tell me what it's called?
Okay. So the organisation we're running in Australia is called CAUSE, which stands for Coalition Against Unsafe Sexual Education. In Australia, the gender programs that have been rolled out have been called safe schools, so that it makes it seem like it's an acceptable, good thing in schools. And so we, with our website URL, it's called stopsafeschools.org or .com, depending on which one you're going to.
And you and I met because you were interested in my experience of being a transgender kid. And
Yeah.
how does that relate to what your concerns are in sex ed in your schools in Australia?
Okay, so the natural progression of what's been going on in Australia and in other countries is that governments around the world are now saying, okay, we're teaching kids in schools that they're not necessarily boys or girls, and they can grow up and be whatever they like to be. But worse than that, we're going to insist that that is enforced by law. And so in Australia, as in other countries, governments are passing what they're calling conversion therapy laws. And in those laws, they say that whatever you feel you are, that is what you are. And no one has the right to change that, not your parents, guiding children, and also for people who are same-sex attracted in the homosexual groups and the LGBT groups, they have no right to say, this is a feeling I really don't want, and seek assistance for it. So the governments are legislating to make it illegal for doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, any religious leaders whatsoever in any denomination or religious group to actually counsel people. In Canada, they're just passing a law where it's even illegal to publicly say sex outside of marriage is against God's will. That imposes a $10,000 Canadian dollar fine. And so what we're looking for, and the whole point is there's not a lot of information around, solid study information around showing that people actually can leave their same-sex attracted lives or change from being trans back to being detransitioning back to their original innate sex. And so what we're running a study looking for people like you, Erin, and other people who have transitioned and who've then gone back and detransitioned and said at the end of the day, it didn't really work. I really thought if I changed who I was, changed my gender, it would solve the gender dysphoria, it would solve my confusion, it would solve all my anxiety, but it didn't. And I've come back and said, well, actually, you in this case, I've come back and said, actually, I am a woman. That was God's plan in your case. And I am a Christian, but we were dealing with a lot of religions. So other religion would say, their beliefs are that they are binary, they are what they're born.
And science says that as well.
Absolutely. There's not one study that scientifically proves gender dysphoria, transgenderism, same-sex attraction is genetic. Not one. 30 years of looking, not one.
And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that it's absolutely not. And I was really concerned because you said that they're working on passing a conversion therapy law, which in Utah, where I live in the United States, they've done this, but it's specifically for licensed therapists. So in your case, they're trying to actually extend that to teachers and counselors and perhaps clergy, which is incredibly concerning to me because, as you know, as I know, kids can develop a transgender identity as a result of trauma, a sexual assault, as a result of having, something really wrong being at home. And so these kids are going to be actually denied access to help that really they need. And have they passed this legislation yet, or are they just proposing it?
Well, we have a bit of a complication, just the way that our governments work. We have a federal government and we have state governments. And our federal government is struggling with what they call the religious freedoms legislation. That's the result of the same-sex marriage that we had passed here a couple of years ago, and they've been struggling with it ever since. But that overlays over some of what our state legislations would do. And so from a religious perspective, the states have not tried to touch this as yet. They've indicated they will. We've looked at their discussion papers, and they're certainly targeting all religious organisations, particularly churches, Christian churches. But in Queensland, one of our northern states, they had a go at it in December, January actually. They tried to pass conversion therapy laws, and Professor John Whitehall and a number of other people were very active, and they actually had the government back down. So the government have now had a committee look at this, and they're ready to have a second bite at the cherry. And so they're at this stage, as with your case, looking at professional doctors and that sort of thing, shutting them down. So that's where we're at. Down here in Victoria, which is the lower part of Australia, certainly they're determined to do the same thing. They've promised, the Premier here has promised he will pass conversion therapy legislation by the end of the year. With the COVID virus and with the bushfires we've had here, that's slowed things down a little bit and given us a bit of breathing space.
Now, what's shocking, you mentioned John Whitehall, and he has he's talked about research that shows that if you give puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to children, that it actually causes problems with their limbic system.
Yes.
And potentially shrinks their brain. I mean, some very serious things happen developmentally to kids when they're put on this. So it's not just about their sex organs or their secondary sex characteristics. These interventions actually cause significant harm and potentially irreversible harm. And so it's shocking to me that doctors would be told that if a kid comes in and says that they are a trans kid, the doctor actually has to provide them with these services rather than suggest that maybe there's an underlying cause for this.
Yeah, look, the Victorian government is the one that's really pushed all the gender ideologies in schools, and they have the Royal Children's Hospital here. The exact document the name doesn't come to mind, but I was looking at it this week. And they themselves admit that there's problems with hormones affecting bone density. Prof Whitehall's study, and it's on our stopsafeschools.com. There's a series of 12 videos there. A little bit long-winded, but because he's a lecturer, he's not a public speaker who speaks fluently in the sense of entertainment. He's really giving you the details. And he points out that the limbic system, which is what is involved with puberty, spreads all through the body. And in actual fact, when you give kids these hormone blockers to give them time to think, it also affects their ability to make decisions, and that whereas they're supposed to be able to sit back and go, okay, well, I really need to have a think about this and make a good decision. The reality is they can't do that properly, because affecting the blockers actually affect that ability as well as their puberty. And also when they say, oh, look, blockers are reversible, well, that's not true. If you put a young child on blockers for 2 or 3 years, they are 2 or 3 years developmentally behind their peers. So if that child were to suddenly start using or stop using blockers, they've suddenly got a whole lot of catching up to do. Where all their friends, girls, for example, might be having periods and breasts and bras and all that. They're only just starting, and so they are already out of sync with their friends. So even from a psychological point of view, as well as physical, the blockers have a severe effect on these kids.
So tell me what's happening in your schools, because your organization is very much targeted about the what I guess in the U.S. is called comprehensive sexuality education, where they are telling kids at a very early age that it's possible to be born in the wrong body. Is that similar kinds of things that are happening in your schools?
Yeah, so we have the same overarching umbrella name. Safe Schools was a program that was supposed to specifically stop bullying of LGBT kids, but it went way beyond that to actually promoting LGBT lifestyles as healthy and normal, and we would challenge both those comments.
It's so interesting how they get this education in under the umbrella of anti-bullying, because that's
yes.
a lot of how they've done it here as well.
Yeah, and when parents here discovered it and started complaining, they then moved it into other courses had to do with, domestic violence in the family, so they made it a domestic violence issue with some of the programs. The name has changed a number of times as parents have spotted it and said, hang on a sec, we're not happy with this. But the reality is they, in many of our states, have rolled it out and they have kept it in place. Where we had under that umbrella of comprehensive sexual education, also the sexual education programs that were there years ago, a lot of the safe schools type materials have now infiltrated into those sexual education programs, where the governments have said, oh, look, safe schools is not compulsory, even though if your child tries to avoid it, it creates all sorts of issues. It is now integrated into the sex ed programs, which are compulsory. So they can say what they like. Our kids are being taught this, and we are really struggling to have it stopped at this stage.
Do you have contact with teachers who are concerned about this? Because I can't imagine if I were a teacher and told that I had to present this information to children, that would, if I didn't buy into this very strange ideology that a child could be born in the wrong body, it would be really hard for me to teach that. So I was just curious. I'm wondering, here in the US, there are teachers who are concerned about it and therapists who are concerned about it, but they're afraid to speak out because of repercussions. Do you have similar issues there?
Exactly the same. A teacher would be considered as being a danger to their students' health and would be dismissed.
They would be considered a danger.
Yes, it's considered
Wow.
dangerous to actually tell a student that they are not the gender they believe in their head, or that the same-sex attraction may not necessarily be innate. Yeah.
And what about parents? Because we've had situations here where children have been taken away from parents who are not affirming a transgender identity. Do you have similar issues there?
Yes, look, with our court systems, and we've had some parents end up in court systems that we're aware of, because they're the family courts, which are dealing with kids under the age of, I think, 16, all those court cases are suppressed, and so they can never be publicised. So parents in Australia, in general, are ignorant of what's going on. With the COVID virus that we've had, and a number of states, or all the states, have actually had parents doing homeschooling, quite a number of parents have suddenly raised their eyebrows and said, gee, we didn't realise this was in this course. And so there's a little bit of a ruckus. So really what we are trying to do from that aspect is we're trying to alert parents to what's going on. And the result, the effect we've had from a lot of parents, or the reaction is, oh, don't be silly. They wouldn't be teaching our kids that. And it's like, well, in actual fact, yes, they are. And it's taken us quite a while to get some of the materials, but it's in the materials. But often again, you've really got to hunt for it because it's been buried in other stuff, you know. And yes, so parents who see it do become concerned, and a number of parents actually, the reason we became aware of this is a couple of parents noticed this material and went very public with it. And one of those parents just recently, by manipulation of social media, ended up with a lawsuit against them, and ended up personally costing them about $60,000. And the whole case cost, I think, nearly $300,000-400,000 Australian dollars for them to try and defend. Yeah.
So, can you be specific about what kind of information is required in the schools?
What do you have in mind? What do you mean?
What kind of like in the U.S. it depending on the grade, uh, some of the curriculum involves teaching children that that their gender is not assigned at birth, their sex is not dependent upon their sex organs. Is that similar to what is being taught in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And what's worse here is we sent in a freedom of information request to our government to say, okay, what exactly do teachers teach? What are the courses? And one of the most disturbing, although they avoided most of our questions, one of the most disturbing things is that a teacher has the right to source third-party material that they, in their professional judgment, totally unsupervised by any oversight whatsoever, what this teacher in her own professional, his own professional judgment thinks is appropriate to teach the students, they can use. And we've had some of those materials shown to us, and it's really been quite horrific that they're showing some really detailed, graphic sexual images to very, very young children because a teacher has a particular feeling about what's appropriate. I don't know any other subject that teachers have that right to do, but in the sexuality thing, they can teach their morality or lack of it to students at whatever age they like. And certainly the whole gender thing is absolutely part of it. Yeah.
Do you have a sense about where this started, about how this became so ingrained in sort of our psyche? Um, and to me, it seems really quickly, because I just became aware of this about a year and a half ago when the conversion therapy legislation was introduced here in Utah. And I realized that it was trying to ban the kind of therapy that actually helped me as a kid. Up until then, I had no idea any of this was going on. And so it seems like I just woke up and all of a sudden I'm just
Yeah.
overwhelmed with how much it's infiltrated into our society, and how strongly the pressure is to accept it. As you said, a teacher will be fired if they don't support this ideology. Do you have any sense as to how it sort of got into the schools so solidly, with so many people being unaware of it?
Look, I can only talk, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any means at all. As I understand it, this started over 50 years ago in America with the gay movement trying to find acceptance. And basically, what we've had mainly is in universities to start with, is we've had all this gender stuff, particularly equality. You know, equality is important. Everybody should be respected. Everybody should be loved. Their voice is important. They're important in society. And this has been going on in our universities for a good 30 odd years, and has slowly been infiltrating into our community. As the university students have graduated, they've moved into places like the media and into social media, into universities themselves. Then you have teachers moving into schools. And I heard not long ago a younger teacher saying it'd be great when all the elderly teachers retire, because we're not going to have any problems anymore teaching this stuff in schools. So really, it's a result of the gay movement wanting, as I understand it, the gay movement wanting acceptance, and then it has moved on into the schools in this way. People keep talking about George Soros being a very wealthy billionaire who has funded a lot of this. I don't know about some other people. And that's possible. Here in Australia, we have an organisation called Get Up, and Get Up have funding from George Soros, and Get Up are very much promoting all this sort of stuff. As I understand it, they're also promoting the drag queens in libraries and that sort of thing. That's my understanding. That might be wrong, but yes.
Well, it's confusing to me because these are educators, and it's hard for me to believe that any of them actually accept that somebody could be born in the wrong body. And I don't know what happens when our teachers are mandated to teach a falsehood to children.
Mm. I think too, look, I think we used to have peer-reviewed studies, and in peer-reviewed studies, everybody from opposing sides would input into documents and papers. That's really changed, and over the last, again, 30 years, if you have a really strongly opposing view to a larger group who are running the peer review, you just don't get to have your say. Professor Whitehall at several times tried to input into things, and they just won't have a bar of it. And other professionals, it's not just him, he's one of the leading people in Australia. And so what university students are being taught is extremely biased. And alongside of that, really the evil sister, if you want to call it that, is atheism. So you stick atheism right next to this other stuff, and you suddenly take morality out of the picture. And I think that probably has an effect on a number of people as far as, how do I deal with this? Is it a moral issue? Is it not? Suddenly, if you just have a view that we're just here by accident, we all should be here enjoying ourselves to the utmost. Well, you know, if you enjoy yourself by, if you're a man changing and pretending to be a woman, that's fine. If you want to be in the same sex relationship, that's fine. And everybody else should mind their own business. And I think that has a lot to do with it.
The fact that it's infiltrated the schools, though, is what really concerns me. That little kids are being taught this. It's just, I don't know if you know my story, but I was a very far left liberal activist for a long time, and definitely subscribed to the moral relativism, that it wasn't my right to tell anybody whether or not their choices were okay. But as I'm looking at this and thinking about just the general mental health of kids, and even though I accepted Christ and I'm a Christian now, even when I look back at it through my more agnostic atheist view, it's hard for me to justify the new narrative, because it's so damaging to kids. It's encouraging them to be, first of all, to become very aware of genitals and talk about them in school at a very early age, and then to really provide them a inaccurate view of reality, which I think is incredibly confusing to kids. When you grow up not being told the truth, then when you get older, you don't know who to trust.
Yeah, yeah, very true. Yeah, look, I raised 5 kids, and as far as being aware of sexuality and genitals, I mean that really comes natural. You know, kids at a different age will ask you different questions just through things that they see or do, and it develops naturally. But we're now at age of 4 and 5 years of age, putting very graphic pictures of genitalia in front of kids, and this, because I'm a guy, I can speak from a guy's perspective, has a huge effect on boys doing that sort of thing, whereas boys might have a cursory interest and in puberty have a greater interest, to actually put it in their face at such a young age. And also where we have this access now to the internet for pornography and that sort of thing, you have a young boy who's shown all these images and friend says, look, you can see all this in greater detail. We're generating a really sexualized group of young people. The outcome of that's not going to be a good thing. But again, you know, if you get your girlfriend pregnant, you just abort the baby, who cares? And that's again the attitude they have. And I agree. And I've said numerous times in my interactions with people on Facebook, wouldn't matter if I was a Christian or not. If I was not a Christian, I would have the same attitudes. I look at this stuff and I think this is not healthy for our society.
Well, and what's interesting to me when I think about it, when I look over the materials that they're presenting, is that I think that not even that long ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, if an adult was talking to a child using such graphic language, presenting them with these kinds of images, that adult would actually be charged
Yeah,
with a crime. That would
yeah.
be considered exposing them to pornography potentially, but also that adults just aren't allowed to talk like that to kids. That as a society, we used to recognize that it's not appropriate for adults to talk to children in this way.
Mm,
And how do children now know what is appropriate and what isn't if they have teachers talking about this in such explicit terms when they're in kindergarten? How do we differentiate then between information versus perversion, and someone who's actually a predator versus someone who's teaching? And that's where I think it gets very concerning, is that these kids are no longer going to be able to discern what is appropriate kinds of topics to talk about with adults, and what are potentially indicators of an unsafe adult.
mm. Yeah, in our Safe Schools program, the teachers are told to create what they call a safe space. And the safe space is they get the kids together, they say, we're going to talk about really personal things, but what is said in this safe space stays in there. So you can talk to me, to the teacher, and to your friends, but you can't tell anyone else. And by implication, that means you cannot tell your parents what you have been
And
talking
that's exactly what predators do. That's
about.
exactly what they do to
Yep.
kids.
Yep, precisely. So you have a child keeping secrets about sexual stuff. And having a whole group of kids together, you're going to get all sorts of things coming out that may or may not be appropriate. But this child now has promised they will not share that with a parent or anyone else. And that's a serious concern here. What do you do about it? Well, the schools sanction that. They say that's fine, but it's not. To parents, it's not. The state is overriding our rights as parents, and that's really what got cause going, was parents being concerned that the state was taking our rights away to teach our kids about sexuality and morality. And the state has done that. In this, we've not had a great deal of success to date, again, because as I said, parents are not overly aware of what's going on, and that is what our goal is to make parents aware. The whole conversion therapy thing, has sort of blossomed out of that as well. We also have our health minister, federal health minister Greg Hunt, was asked by Professor Whitehall and 200 other doctors signed a document saying, could you please have an inquiry into the gender clinics to see what's going on? And he's come back and said, look, I'll let the states work that out for themselves rather than doing federally. But all our states are what we call Labor, you'd call probably Democrat, I think you call them, left-leaning states, and they'll all get together and say this is great and move on. So we're now working on fighting that as well. It's all part of the same thing.
So for those of us who are concerned about this, and you know, I don't know that we have an organization similar to yours here in the U.S. yet. What would you recommend parents and activists and anybody who's concerned about this? How would you recommend that they sort of start fighting against this in our schools?
Yeah, look, we're only very early in this as well, to be quite honest. We've only been doing this for about a year and a half, 2 years. Really, I don't know how effective your politicians are, but certainly getting politicians on board. Again, because I'm a Christian, our churches have been very lax over the years. That's our fault. We've sat back. We've really fallen into the trap of, you know, again, with the whole gay movement, we don't want to put these people down. We don't want to make them feel bad. So we've gone to the other extreme of saying absolutely nothing. We've also bought into the and I don't know if that's like that in America, but that the state and religion should be two separate things. That's all very well, but the state has been overwhelmingly dabbling into religions and telling religions what to do, but we're not supposed to do it the other way. And so parents within churches, within Jewish mosques and, Jewish temples and mosques and that, need to get together, start putting pressure on the politicians. I mean, politicians love their job. If they think they're going to lose their jobs, they will start listening. And that has been very effective in the UK in a couple of cases where they've really pressurised their politicians. And we're looking at organising to do the same thing here, to pressurise our politicians and say, if you want our support, you really need to be listening to what we're saying and addressing our concerns. I mean, again, speaking for Christians, we've been lax. We've been letting secular politicians run our governments, believing they're doing our job for us and more fool us. They obviously weren't, else all these things wouldn't have come through so quickly. I mean, we've had abortion, we've had euthanasia, you know, abortion up to birth in Australia, by the way. The minute before your baby's due to be born, you can change your mind and have it aborted. You've got euthanasia now in quite a few states and all this gender stuff. And that our politicians have put through, and it's our fault for being lax and not fighting hard. So parents need to be pressurising the politicians, and they need to be getting together. We're also looking at setting up online portals for schools so that parents at a particular school can log in and say, I'm concerned, and put their name in there, so that as we move forward and we say, okay, we want to start being active, then those parents can be activated and start helping, maybe to spread brochures or to talk to their friends. I mean, mums in car parks, I don't know what it's like in America, but mums in car parks drop their kids off and then stand there for an hour nattering to each other. It's a great way to pass information, and often these mums will go, gee, I didn't know that, really, you know, is that happening? I mean, in our schools we've had kids being taught anal sex being standard, sex toys, there's what's called BDS or whatever, playing around with. So we've gone from teaching kids the biology of sexuality to teaching them how to have sex and to ignore morality. And those two steps are not steps that parents are happy with.
Well, and it's not just ignoring morality, but it's also basically these messages are really dangerous for kids. You don't want kids messing around with anal sex and sex toys. Their bodies are not in any way ready, or and they're not mature enough to handle these kinds of decisions. And so to me, it's just shocking that we would be, on so many levels. And it's confusing to me that here it's called the liberal the Democrats. You said it's labor where you are.
Yes,
The
yeah.
So it's confusing to me, because as somebody who grew up very much on the left, it's confusing to me how it is that we're advocating these kind of policies. Because one of the things that attracted me to being on the left was my compassion for children, from my concern. I have always had a very strong advocacy for children, and so it's really confusing to me how all of a sudden that's flipped, and we're no longer advocating for the safety of children, teaching them to be safe, teaching them consent, teaching them appropriate boundaries. Now we're doing just the opposite. We're
Yeah.
violating their boundaries. We're teaching them that consent doesn't matter, and we're encouraging them to engage in behaviors that are really dangerous. And so I am looking at all this and trying to figure out, how is it that the left is getting this so wrong? And again, I think a lot of it is that whole idea of tolerance, that for so long we have been trying to be tolerant, especially of the gays, that there's been this narrative that they've been really treated poorly, they've been beaten up, they've been harassed and bullied, and of course nobody that I know advocates that kind of behavior. So we've tried to be very tolerant,
Mm.
hands off, and a lot of cases even you know advocating anti-bullying, because we don't want people to be harassed.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
it's almost backfired, because now not only are they pushing this agenda, but now I'm seeing an increasing um, anti-religion, anti-Christian, anti-moral backlash. I even
Mm.
have had some really strange interactions with people who have insisted um, that religious rights, that religious freedoms shouldn't be respected, because God is unprovable, that God is a myth, and that so it's very interesting to me. So I'm like, okay, you're saying that somebody can be born in the wrong body, but then you're saying there isn't a God, and it's very convoluted. But it's concerning to me that it's almost going. It's like we've been so tolerant that now they're not even tolerant of us.
That's right. Yeah, totally intolerant. Yeah, well, certainly the Labor Party that started in Australia started by the Catholic Church in concern initially for workers receiving rights, but gradually what's happened is all the Christians in the Labor Party have been pushed out, so that virtually now there are barely any whatsoever, and it is just full of atheists, and they have taken over the narrative and taken control. We also have here what's called the Greens, the people who push the global warming and all that sort of stuff, and they're very much in each other's pockets with the Labor Party. They're not a huge force here, but they're certainly having considerable influence. That's the case for sure.
Well, I appreciate your efforts. And as we finish up here, is there any last thing that you want to say that you didn't get a chance to say?
Yeah, look, we have two websites. What we'd ask people to do is go and have a look at our www.stopsafeschools.com. That's the information site. You'll find a lot of information on transgenderism, more than anything else. Even though we sort of started up with the same-sex marriage, LGBT stuff in schools, it's more become that issue. That's really been the great issue here. And so there's videos by parents, there's videos by professionals, there's videos by even some very activist lesbian ladies who really object to all this stuff. Then we've got our portal, and what we're really looking for is, so we're putting a survey together, we're going to put a study together where we are getting information from people who are no longer same-sex or who have unwanted same-sex attraction or who have left their transgender lives behind. And you go to the portal, you'll be able to fill in a profile which gives us statistics. So you'll measure yourself and say, before I changed, my anxiety level, for example, was maybe 7. After I left my lifestyle behind and just went on with a lifestyle that's not an LGBT lifestyle, now my anxiety might be 5. So that would be an improvement of 20%. And so this portal is running, and we're not sure how long we have got, but we'll just keep this running and keep gathering information. The results have been stunning, whereas we've been told that no one ever leaves their same-sex attracted life. No one who has transgendered goes back and is successful or improved their lifestyle. On anxiety, just for example, I'll pick that one. the average has been around 43% improvement in anxiety in leaving their LGBT lifestyles behind. The lowest one would probably, out of a range of about 6 questions with values on them, would be friendships, and that would still be an improvement of around about, I think, 23%. So there is an improvement, but you can understand not necessarily as high, because you'll have moved out of one group of people. There'll be friendships you'll have lost, there'll be other friendships you'll have gained. So, but overwhelmingly, the study is showing that it's very positive. What we need is more and more numbers to be able to say to the politicians, have a look at these stats, have a look at these people. And so people answer that questionnaire, and then they can either put in their testimony of a written testimony about how their life was before they changed, during the change, and afterwards. And we will use those to validate the figures, so that we can't have people saying, oh, you made those numbers up. We've actually got people who've either in writing or in a video, or you can do it audio, leave their story of change. And we're not looking for your story from the moment you got nappies to the moment you're going to put it in the ground. We're really talking about that change, what your life was before the change and what your life was like afterwards. And we're hoping that people can do that if they do a video in about 7 to 10 minutes. Sometimes it's a bit longer, and that's fine. Just keep in mind, our academics have got to look at this stuff, and if you've got a video that's very long, they really don't have time to look at all of it, and they might miss some of the bits that you would think important. So yeah, if people can help, and Erin has done that, and really appreciate your efforts, Erin, but we really need heaps of people to come on board and do this, and understand that people can be a bit scared about doing this. You can give yourself an alias so people don't recognise your name. You can mask your voice, and you can mask your face. And we've given you some apps that can do that on your phone. If it's an issue, we'll do it for you. We'll video you like this, and then we'll mask it for you, send it to you, say you're happy with this, and then you can put it on the site. And it is critical that we get people to support this, because at the moment, as I said, our politicians, I shouldn't say liberal, because it's the conservative politicians, have no real materials to fight back with, and this will give them a real tool, and we're happy to spread this tool around the world to whoever wants it. Yeah.
Well, and I'm really excited that you're gathering this information. Excuse me. I'm really excited that you're gathering this information, because it is so critical. And it just breaks my heart thinking that children will be denied mental health services that will potentially help them understand, a sexual assault or a trauma, or, something that's going on at home, instead of just having that covered up with, in my case, I had same-sex attraction when I was younger, because that was part of my trans identity. I cultivated, being a lesbian, because I thought, of course, if I'm a boy, then I'm gonna, need to have a girlfriend. And so, I'm just thinking about what my therapist did to help me understand who I am versus what they would do now, which is to say, you are transgender and you're attracted to women.
Yeah.
And to me, that's just, on so many levels, it's just heartbreaking that these kids aren't getting that. And I wanted to tell people that your website has just phenomenal information. We mentioned John Whitehall a couple of times, and I think there's some videos on there. And he is more of an academic, but the information in his videos is powerful, because he talks about how damaging these medications are, and he talks about how we are finding out that these identities we adopt, as most people know, kids go through all sorts of identities when they're kids, but they're starting to really hone in on what is it that causes a child at a young age to develop these identities. And even for those who are very LGBT positive, one of the things that I just want to bring up is that these conversion therapy bans prohibit therapists from helping a child who is, say, 7 years old and engaging in same-sex behavior, because that's now protected. And I think most people would admit that we do not want elementary school children engaging in sexual activities. But these conversion therapy bans prohibit therapists from helping a very young child who's engaged in sexual activities if it's a same-sex partner, because that's now considered conversion therapy. And that's something that I think most people don't understand, is that these are dangerous on so many levels. And so even if you're totally 100% pro LGBT, um, these, I hope that if people really understood what these conversion therapy bans do, they would be against them.
Mm. You know, John Whitehall talks about it, but I just got some figures from the Royal Children's Hospital, and it proves that around 97% of kids who are transgender, gender dysphoric, will grow out of it by age 25. There's an interesting study on the brain which shows that kids who are in their teens actually engage in more risky behaviour, and it's all part of the moving out of the home. You know, teenage life is all about becoming independent and moving out. By 25, you suddenly, early 20s, 25 years of age, the effective risk becomes very real to you, and you back off and think, hang on a second, you evaluate it much better. And so by age 25, as I said, 97% of people who suffer from gender dysphoria, when you say grow out of it, have either learned to live with it or have overcome it. To put these 100% of these kids on hormone blockers and to affirm them, the clinics are telling us they have a 100% success rate. So you have 97% of kids who should not be going into transgender lives are being forced to. And how that is happening is absolutely beyond me. That the politicians, that parents, even the LGBT groups would support that is beyond me.
Yeah, I can't think of any other case where doctors treat someone without a clear ability to diagnose that something is actually wrong, and then give them something that's going to cause them lifelong side effects. It's just, it is really shocking. So I am so thankful for what you're doing in Australia. And hopefully we can do the same thing in Canada and the US and the UK, Sweden, Germany. It's
Yeah.
happening all over the world. So we really need to get that data. So if anybody's watching this who has, detransitioned or resolved unwanted sexual attractions, please go to this website and share your story, because it's really important.